Welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. I'm Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And you are in for a treat today if you're watching the live feed, because we are, there's an Instagram thing that floats around right now where all of these wives secretly conspire to make their husbands wear the same shirt and show up at a gathering, and they all show up embarrassed because they're all in the same shirt. That's us today.
Yeah, there we are.
Our wives didn't do it. They're both sick today, which is...
They are.
Yeah, big family gathering over the weekend.
Yes.
We just shared the food
everything.
germs, I guess. Yeah. So far, we're good.
Truly.
You're good?
Yeah. I'm good.
All right,
I'm
nice.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, so our immune systems are working. Others are being tested at the moment. Maybe you're seeing that in your family too. But either way, it's a great time of year, and it's exciting to be with family and alive and able to see people and able to gather and all these things. We shouldn't take those things for granted anymore, right?
No,
so it's good. So if you're new with us, welcome. If you're watching us online, that's awesome. You can do that on Spotify or on our YouTube channel. And you're listening to us on any other device. It's great to have you with us. It's great to have you review and share. All of those things are really helpful. We are a father and son pastoral team serving a local church in Methuen, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, just south of the New Hampshire border.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
tax-free New Hampshire.
That's right. And our goal of this podcast is to be able to share some of the conversations that pastors tend to have throughout the week, the ones that don't really make it into the pulpit or into the lectern, but still have bearing on our life, and they're still helpful to bring illustration and information into the things that we do. These are the conversations that pastors have.
Sure.
They're biblically based because we believe that the Bible is at the heart of all things that we do. Mm-hmm. But they vary in topic and in information. So we're glad you're here, and we're glad you're joining us today. We begin all of these times together with defining some key words that we use in our terminology, and we call those the theological term of the week.
The theological term of the week. This week's term is polity. Polity.
I think back in the 90s, my wife had one of those that sticks in your pocket.
Polity.
Polity
is
pocket.
Such a lonely word.
Yeah, polity pocket, right?
Polity pocket. Yeah. There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the little toys, like the
choking
hazards.
That's
Remember
true.
Those?
Yeah.
Guys, boys had micro machines.
Isn't it in like the clauses?
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there
right.
is.
And
He gives that. Yeah, the first. Yeah.
There's a series on Disney Plus that, that Tim Allen is doing a new Santa Claus series, right? And one of the gifts he gives is the.
Gotta say, I'm struggling with that. I'm trying to watch that because I like Tim Allen and I've loved the Santa Claus movies.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle with how they have to front load the conflict in these series. Like you have to get through so much emotion in those first 45 minutes. And then
before you can get into like the resolution of the
before
story.
You can get into the resolution of the story. So they create I don't know, maybe it's a new way of doing genre or whatever. You're cold hit with conflict, and you find yourself saying, man, do I even want to deal with that topic?
I'm not sure I like these people enough yet these characters enough yet to sit through all of this conflict to then find resolution. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with polity, but it's really
nothing
interesting.
to do with polity. But those are the rabbit trails that happen in the pastor's study.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. We're going to see a shift in how stories are told because of these streaming platforms.
That's right.
And because it starts off with movies that are just too long to be movies, and they chop them up into being like 3 or 4 part series and then long episodes. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, but obviously we have a connection to the Santa Claus character because we've got 3 movies coming in. Mm-hmm. But in these however long they're making, sometimes they're making like 30 minutes long, but I think that's like
interesting
45.
too, right? They go from 30 to 47, 48 minutes, and you never really know. It's just there's a lot of flexibility with that.
So it's difficult because for those of you who haven't, I'm not giving anything away. There's no spoiler alert here. I mean, the whole concept here is that Santa is going to retire, right? Mm-hmm. So to be hit with that going in the first episode it's jarring. It's kind of like, oh man, do I want to watch this? Because it's just too painful.
Interesting.
So you've got to work your way into them.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
yeah, but
Bonus,
polity.
that was bonus. That's bonus
That was
features.
bonus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about polity.
Polity.
Yeah.
Polity, different from liturgy, because liturgy is how churches function or carry out their everyday religious worship.
Mm-hmm.
Polity is how churches connect to one another and relate to one another.
So church to church. So
Church
liturgy
to church.
is how you do church within your walls, and polity is the way that you connect to other churches.
Exactly. It's the places where you agree.
Okay.
So, and it comes from the concept. We're going to use a word that nobody likes right now. Okay, comes from a Greek word, same word as politics,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the idea of how we get along. Politics is the word politics. Believe it or not, folks, means how do I get along? How do I connect to other people?
Sure.
So when we're talking polity, we're talking about how do I build connections to other people? And every church group has a polity. They have an area of things that they agree on, and the things that they agree on are quite often shared with other congregations around the country, around the world, even in the same community. I ministered for a long time in New Jersey, very large community. Well, funny because it was actually smaller
for New Jersey, large for
smaller than the city that we're in here in Methuen, but it was kind of a humorous area because it was a resort community.
Mm-hmm.
So in the wintertime, it was 29,000 people.
Yeah.
And in the summertime, it was 129,000 people.
Right.
And so it was. We actually had 3 churches that shared polity within about 2 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those churches were doing very well as far as attendance is concerned and all of those things, which is pretty crazy when you think of New Jersey. You probably think of New Jersey as a state that isn't very religious. It's not in the South, it's not in the Midwest, but still 3 churches all doing really well.
Yeah.
All within a very small confined area. And we all have the same polity, which means that in general, we agreed upon a lot of things and how we related to one another and how individuals in our church related.
Yeah. So we share, you would share similar theological conviction.
Yes, that's one of the things in polity.
Right? You would share, obviously the core beliefs are the same.
Core beliefs.
Right. So you have, rewind that a little bit. So your core beliefs are the same. And then you also, the way you express those beliefs are also similar.
Yes.
Right. Because, action comes from belief. And so the way that you act upon those beliefs are similar. So even, we talked last week about liturgy, and you have even similar liturgies, not exact though. And that's what makes them different churches, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So your church liturgy may include prayer at certain points in your sermon, or you may incorporate certain like readings or creeds even, and other churches may not. Or like you may sing like a blend of different types of music from different eras, and another church may focus on a particular genre or area of music.
And all of that's liturgy.
Those are all liturgy moments, right? But you can share some of those. You can have unique liturgies to your church,
yes,
but also share the same polity,
yes,
with another church, because you get along in all of these things.
Yes.
You just express them differently.
Yes,
which is why you would have multiple churches.
Yes,
right? Like,
yes,
because this church is like their liturgy is slightly different from this one, and people will say like, I connect better with this one than that one, and so that's the one I'm going to go and serve in.
Right.
That's why you have some differences, but you can still do some things together.
Yes.
And the church I served in, we express that in a fun way. So our every year when we had around Easter time, you have these traditional services in your liturgy, right?
Yeah.
Some churches do a Good Friday service and then Easter Sunday, right? In our church, we actually would do a Maundy Thursday service and then a Good Friday service and then an Easter Sunday service. But on the Maundy Thursday, we would take communion, and that would be kind of us as a church. But the Good Friday service, we actually would connect with 2 or 3 other churches in the area,
right?
And we would rotate whose church would host Good Friday that year, And then we'd also rotate whose pastor would preach, and we'd actually have it differently. So like
Interesting, yeah.
So like the one year we hosted Good Friday at our location, but one of the other pastors preached at it. And then another year, like it was at another church and I preached at it. And so those are ways that we kind of exercised and encouraged that polity. We had some differences. We were in different denominations even. Like the one church was a Nazarene church and we were a Baptist church. So it was different.
Right.
But there was enough in common that we could share the service and share some bonds and connect, right?
Now, there's another step here in polity, and that's a place of agreement, which would separate you perhaps from another denomination.
Right.
And that agreement is how we agree to rule and live with one another. All right,
within the congregation.
Within the congregation, and then you find other churches. You might find other churches that have a similar rule and agreement. So polity gets into this whole governing issue, and it's how we decide to agree. And there are lots of polities out there, but basically when you're talking church government, then you're talking about, is this a congregational rule where everybody in the congregation has a say, and that's an aspect of polity. It's
not just, so you're moving from not just the way that different churches relate to other
each
churches,
other, right?
But also how you govern within your particular church.
Yes,
and
exactly.
governance is different than liturgy.
Yes, absolutely, because it's still about how do we agree and how do we come to an agreement. So you may have a congregational church where they're going to agree because everybody in the church votes on something, and you have a majority rule, or you have supermajorities, or things like that. And there are other churches where there's a group of chosen ones, the elders, if you will, and they're going to make all of the decisions, and the congregation's going to just enjoy it. Or you have pastor rule, where you've got one guy and he makes all of the decisions for everything in the church.
Or a team of guys.
Or a team of guys, yep. Or there's another theory where you've got outside polity, where you've got all of the pastors of all of the churches in the area who are coming together and deciding how how all of those churches are going to rule.
Right. So that's more of the Presbyterian model, right? Like
exactly.
These different churches in there is like it'd be like a state assembly kind of thing, right?
Well, they call it a synod.
Right. They do, right?
Yes.
But if you're not familiar with that, like think about your state's assembly. You have all these people
that
from
would
different
be Methodists,
towns.
right?
Right. They call it an assembly, don't they? Yeah. You have different towns, like or cities within your state, and they would send representatives to your capital, and they would exercise policy on behalf of your town, right? And that's similar. Like Methodists and Presbyterians will do that. They'll have this, a synod or an assembly of leaders.
Or in Catholicism, you have a parish,
right? The parish would be the church. Right.
And then it goes into but a parish can also be any larger section where a bishop is over. So, and that comes from the ancient Rome divided its counties or its ruling areas into parishes.
Right, like Louisiana.
So, Louisiana, exactly, because Louisiana carries over that Roman rule kind of concept. The Roman Catholicism very strong in Louisiana, so you have parish rule, and so that's why you have. So a parish is some place that's ruled by a bishop, and over a bishop is a cardinal, and the cardinals gather in Rome. That's kind of the way they're structured. That's their polity in some ways. So it's how do we agree? So there's a doctrinal issue there, but it's also how do we continue to agree? What is our local government, or what is our governing policy going to be like?
Yeah. So how do we structure the business of the church and the decision making, and where does the buck stop? Right.
Yeah. Where does the money go? That's an aspect of polity. Yeah.
So there you go. So lots of churches. You may have noticed this over your time of being in churches. Like churches tend to govern themselves in a variety of different ways. Right?
Yes.
And that internal governance, the larger term is polity, but polity also applies to the way in which churches relate to each other.
Yes.
So it's kind of this dual purpose word.
Right. Because if you have That's the thing, right? If you have a bunch of churches and you all have the same polity,
Mm-hmm.
then it's easy for you to actually get together and have conversation because you're going to make your decisions in similar ways. You also have similar belief statements,
Mm-hmm.
so you're going to be able to carry through on a lot. You're going to be able to agree.
Yeah.
Polity is about agreement,
Right.
so you're going to be able to agree on a lot of things and get a lot of things done.
There you go. All right. So there you go. If you've ever heard the term polity and wondered what we were talking about, hopefully that's helpful. That's our theological term of this week.
The theological term of the week.
So we began our Advent series this week.
Yes.
Yes. Sunday. It's Tuesday. I'm thrown.
We
The whole
almost-
sick family thing. I don't know what's
We
going on.
almost need to put the Advent wreath stuff.
Oh, that'd be
right?
cool.
Wouldn't
Have
it
the
be
candle
cool?
in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
If you're just listening and not watching, pretend we just did that.
Yes.
So we began our Advent series. We're talking about Christmas traditions, and we're approaching Advent from sort of a traditional point of view this
Yes.
year, right? So we have the Advent candles out. We're lighting those, and our sermons are the liturgy of this season, right? Our sermons are centered around those traditional meanings for each candle,
Right.
right? And we're tying in some traditional thoughts and practices of Christmas into the sermons. And so I kicked off this last series. I began it with the Hope Candle,
Hope candle.
also known as the Prophet Candle. And I went to Luke chapter 1 and talked about a prophet. We talked about Zechariah, who is blessed with a son late in life, he and his wife Elizabeth, and they have John, who is the prophet who proclaims the coming of Jesus, but Zechariah kind of proclaims it too, right? And so there's this this preamble to Jesus's arrival. I think when we get to Christmas, we open our Bibles right to Luke 2.
Yes. Yeah.
And we'll skim Luke 1 and we'll like, oh, that's cool. Mary went to see her cousin and her cousin's baby leapt for joy. And then we move on. Like we like this, but the story of Zechariah is fun, right? Like he has this encounter with Gabriel. He's mute for 9 months during the pregnancy. And then as he declares his son's name in public, his tongue is loosened and he proclaims God's glory and has this
picture.
Great prophecy. It's a really great passage. It's a lot of fun to read and to dig into. And I was doing that a lot this last week in preparation for the sermon. And one of the things that stood out to me throughout this is Zechariah and Elizabeth's hope.
Yes.
I think in the sermon I was talking about how the beginning of this passage, once Luke gets through his, hey, Theophilus, I'm sending you a letter or two, piece, like he gets into talking about the story, and it begins with this statement of in the days of King Herod. And we'll often read that. I was saying we often read that line as just a date marker.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, okay, this is, Herod was alive. Good to know. And then we keep reading. But if you think about that culturally, what really Luke is also saying is that this is a dark time in
It was
Israel's
like
history.
during the Great Depression.
Yeah, right? Like, yeah, when you hear that today, you would think like, okay, the teens, 20s, 30s, right? Okay,
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
But you're not really thinking date when you hear the Great Depression as an American. When you hear the Great Depression as an American, you're thinking
Flour sacks that are printed so that you can make dresses out of them.
right, and the Beverly Hillbillies,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
this, like that look of them piling into the jalopy and traveling across the Southwest as they tried to
No, that
chase-
was my era.
I know,
Come on.
ancient Great Depression.
Ancient-
Yeah. But they are like a Depression era family,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
their
yeah.
style is all Depression era. Who
Yes.
happens to, they're a holdover from the Depression.
Making soap out of lard.
Yeah. So, right. So we key into certain phrases like that, and we don't necessarily think of dates. We think of an era or what's going on culturally. And I believe that's similar in Luke's day too.
Yeah.
I think when he's referencing certain elements of Israel's history, he's not just telling you a date, although I think he cares about that.
Yeah.
He's keying you into what's happening in the culture.
Yes.
And letting you know and what's going on. And so when Luke begins the story of in the days of happens during the days of King Herod, then you're remembering that what's happening culturally with Israel. And it's a dark time. It's a difficult time. Rome has Rome has ownership of Israel. They've installed Herod as this hybrid king, and it's not a great time to be a worshiper of Yahweh in this day.
Right.
But then the contrast of that is Zechariah and his wife.
Can I throw another wrinkle in here?
Yeah.
Because this is interesting too. Because so Herod always wanted to be a Jew. He was not. He was actually a descendant of Esau, which is, and
even more offensive.
Even more offensive, exactly. And he was despised by Israel. I mean, Israel, and he was always trying to be Jewish, even though he wasn't. He builds the temple, which you would think is this great and awesome thing because the temple was gorgeous, and the Jews at the time really wanted the temple to almost be considered one of the great wonders of the world. And yet in all of that building, in all of that greatness, and it's not just, by the way, it's not just the temple he builds. He builds like basically a chariot race course.
The Herodium.
The Herodium, right? He does all of this. He builds a city for the Romans, Caesarea Philippi.
Yep.
He does all of this building, and normally in the Bible, the good kings, the best kings, are identified with their construction projects. And this man is despised, even though he's done all of this building and all of this construction. And it's because he's always trying to be a Jew, and the Jews hate him because he's not a Jew. And they look at him and they say, "This is not our king. This is not what we want." And every single day that they wake up to all of this stuff that he's supposedly doing, it just beats them down more.
Yeah. This is not our king. Let's hope that the king arrives.
Right.
That's the environment that's happening here. And you get this story of this faithful couple who are practicing faithfully this calling on God from God to administer the work of the temple. So Zechariah arrives, does his duty there. Luke describes him as this person who's faithfully following God. And I love that. I think it's a great picture, a great contrast, and a great picture of what hope is. Hope is. I was saying yesterday, hope is best illustrated against a dark background.
Right.
And you see that with this couple. I think I talked about the stat in the service. I talked about, I think, on the podcast a couple weeks ago, right? Did we talk about this on the podcast?
Too. Yeah. Well, no, we didn't. We talked about it.
The pre-show. This is a pre-show conversation?
Pre-show conversation.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
So, the stat I had heard recently, and it's troubling, is that here's how this is couched. So, there are a group of people. That. A group of people who are capable of working who are not in the culture right now.
Yes.
This is for the end of November 2022. So if you're listening to this in 5 years, hopefully this is different, and you're saying that's not true. But right now, in our culture, there will always be this group, but this group is larger than we think it should be at the moment.
Yeah.
And so, of the group of people who are capable of working but have chosen not to work, or are depressed out of work, or do not currently have a job and are looking for one,
or maybe not looking,
or maybe not looking at all, there is a disproportionate amount of those people who are male.
Yes.
Right. So they've been able to. We have these stats that tell us what percentage of the population of males should be working, what percentage of the population of females are working, and it is wonky in this particular area.
Right.
More men are not working than should be. Right. And so, of this group of men who are out of work currently but could be working, they average about 2,000 hours of screen time a year, which is 6 straight hours on your phone or on your television. Per day.
Right.
So 6 hours a day. So their full-time job right now is scrolling Facebook.
Right.
And of those men who are spending 6 hours on death scrolling, 50% of them are on some sort of pain medication. And that's troubling. I mean, when I see a stat like that, I see a group of people who are depressed. Right. And I see a group of people more so who have lost hope.
That's the key. Because it's the hopelessness that marks them out. as we were beginning this conversation, as we were talking about moving toward Advent and this idea of the candle of hope, I have been burdened by the fact that hopelessness right now is the marker of American culture.
It sure feels that way.
Yeah.
It sure feels that way. I think that there's just this malaise or this depression or this level of hopelessness that permeates everything we do. We've talked a lot about this recently, and the way that I see this happening is in our art. Like, I think that art is a really good precursor to what's going to happen in your culture in general, right? Art moves ahead of culture typically.
Yes.
And so if you think about our art that we're producing as Americans, like our predominant forms of art at the moment are usually television and movies and music, right? And you could probably throw YouTube and social media, like content generation into that too, right? But in most of these areas, there's just there's not hope. Like, there's not creativity. This is what I'm struggling with.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I'm not seeing a lot of creativity, particularly in larger media outlets. And actually, probably most of the creativity is happening in the social media world. But in the larger media outlets, it seems like there's a lack of creativity. The same stories are being retold.
Yep.
Studios are struggling.
Let's remake the movie that we remade last year.
Yeah, studios are struggling because...
How many Spider-Man movies can you have?
These studios are struggling. And we blame certain like political things on their struggle, right? Like, we'll talk about like Disney's not what it used to be because they've all gone woke, right? And like that's the thing that will hurl in that direction. And I have some trouble with Disney's content and other studios' content. But I think you get to this point where you are trying to craft your art to hit a small demographic because you've just lost the ability to tell great stories.
Right.
Like, if you're just inspired by a great story, or if you have just come across the screenplay for a great story, like, that communicates something so deeply to you that you don't particularly care about hitting target demographics. You care about communicating the story. A while back, I came across a documentary talking about the creation of Forrest Gump. The movie.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And it was really fun. Like, so you're in the mid-90s here, or 95, I think Forrest Gump comes out, which means in 1990, the screenplay is written. And that screenplay got written and landed on the bottom of a stack of screenplays. And it was just in a giant pile of screenplays that were being ignored and missed. And somebody, I think, was like cleaning up the stack and like saw that one, started flipping through it. And the story was so powerful that they needed to get it in front of the right people. Right? A stack of others. This story was so good and so creative and so well done that they needed to get this in front of the right people to get it greenlit and get it made. And then it created this kind of momentum where more and more people who encountered that story all had to fight to make sure the story could be told because it moved them. There was something powerful about the story, and it needed to be told to the point where you get to where the director and the main actor, right? Is it Spielberg who does? I don't remember. I'm trying to remember who the director was now. I blanked on the director, but the director and the main actor, Tom Hanks, actually get to the point where they conspire together to, the studio was cramping the story. And they didn't want to fund certain parts of the story because the production was getting expensive. And so they start imposing, typical studio control over the story. And the response was this director and this actor pulled out their checkbooks and wrote the check to make sure that the movie could be told in the proper way.
Yeah.
And which turned into Oscars for everybody. And it's also why Tom Hanks is as wealthy as he is, because he backed most of the movie, and all the proceeds ended up back in his wallet. It was a great story. And you didn't have to worry about, when creativity was so powerful and so dominant, then you weren't trying to just write a story to hit a demographic. You were trying to create a good story.
Right. Good story.
And I think good stories come out of great hope.
Right.
And come out of times of great hope.
Yes.
They interview the author, like all of these things, like they come out of a place of hope. And that's why I think, like, if you look at the 80s, right, they have great movies in the 80s that are incredibly creative. Stuff
Sure.
that's like forward-looking, stuff
Yeah.
that's just weird.
Back to the Future.
Yeah, like you got all kinds of strange and interesting movies and great movies and really poor movies, but the storytelling was powerful in the 1980s because I think culturally, like, America was in this place of hope.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then out of that comes great storytelling.
Yes.
And I think a way to tell how your culture's doing in this little area of hope is to see, like, are there great stories being told in the movie theater?
Exactly. So just to put some other perspective, some more history perspective, okay, there's always been a segment of the population that is hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
And they attract attention because of their hopelessness. So, case in point, coming out of World War II, there's a group of people, there's a group of men in particular who are so is personally, spiritually wounded, if I'm going to just use a different idea, by that war, that they start becoming very negative and they start writing negative poetry. And that negative poetry is often equated with a stereotype of a guy wearing a beret and a beard. And it becomes, they are beaten down by what they have experienced, and they become known as beatniks. Right. They are a group of predominantly men who reject the joy of being out of the war, and they are struggling with their own depression, and they are the hopeless culture. And you read, if you were to go back and read beatnik poetry of the 50s, which is pretty awful, what you get is just a whole negative vein and an aspect of hopelessness. You move into the 60s, and quite honestly, the hippie generation is a generation of hopelessness. It's Timothy Leary saying that we need to switch to LSD and just tune out, right? And then advance to the 80s. And in the 80s, you have a movement in high schools. And here's where things get really crazy, right? You have this movement in high schools where there's an entire generation, or there's part of that generation that is focused on death, focused on life stinks. I remember James Dobson talking about this in the 70s, 80s, and talking about his thought that came out of the whole abortion thing. And if you can abort somebody in the womb, but somebody else is born, how does that create anything more than despair for a lot of these kids? It's like, I could have been aborted. Obviously I'm born, but who really wants me? They start dressing in trench coats. They start dyeing their hair black. And it just, life becomes dark. And there is this dark vein that runs through our culture of people who are hopeless.
Yeah.
I think the current dark vein of hopelessness in high schools it's
moving around sexual identity.
Around sexual identity. And I think that we're giving in to the whole transgender thing is a statement of, I'm hopeless in my own body. I don't understand who I am. I don't have any hope. Maybe there's hope in changing who I am to something that I'm not. Right. And this is dangerous because, I mean, the culture of, the culture that was into tattoos and piercings
and Edgar Allan Poe
15 years ago, is now a culture that's into, chemicals and
more dangerous body modification. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hopelessness. It's, I have nothing to live for. I'm going to try and find some other way of coping because of my hopelessness. And, just throwing this out here, the statistics are that 50% of 50% of transgenders who do not, or who go through body modification actually end up committing suicide. It's a massive number.
Yeah.
Right? Massive number. But do they commit suicide because of their body modification, or do they commit suicide because their body modification was an attempt to overcome their hopelessness and it didn't work?
Right. It's entirely possible. And I think it's entirely likely. And the more that we encourage hopelessness, I think the more we end up moving our entire culture toward it.
Absolutely.
Right? Rather than responding to hopelessness with hope and encouragement and
creativity and imagination.
Yeah.
And all of those things, creativity, imagination, development, invention, all of those things come out of hope. It's like, if you don't have any hope, for example, Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone by accident. He was hoping to create a hearing aid for his deaf parents so that they would be able to hear. He had a hope that he could reverse his parents' deafness.
Yeah.
You know where we are now in the culture? If you're deaf,
you should be encouraged in your deafness.
You should be encouraged in your deafness.
Yeah.
Don't try to be a hearer. Yeah, there's
a stigma for people who
are
deaf who would try to find hearing. Yeah.
If you put there's a cochlear implant that's now possible, right? And it's a hard surgery, doesn't always work well, doesn't necessarily get you to the result that you were expecting, right? But you can do cochlear implants. Do you know that in the deaf community, you are ostracized for wanting to be a hearer? Because you should just live in your deafness.
Right.
In other words, you should live, and obviously no one is hearing me right now who is deaf, but maybe you're watching on
Could be, yeah,
YouTube,
it might
right?
be closed captioning, right?
There should always be the desire to improve yourself. There should always be hope.
Right. And I think that's an issue. And it's not to like, this is an interesting spot that you have to kind of parse and be careful. I think maybe maybe we have to do this because of culture, but we lump a lot of things together here. So if we start having this conversation about a segment of people who are outside of what the bounds of normal, wanting to move into normal, suddenly like there's this, that's wrong. We're shaming these people.
Right. Who defines normal?
Yeah. How do you claim normal or whatever? And the idea here is not to bring shame into a situation.
No.
Right. And we've talked a lot about shame a lot recently too, but outside of the podcast room with some other people in student ministry and everything, like shame is not the point, and shame is not the tool. Even hope is the tool.
Yeah. And
I think people will leverage shame and try to create change in somebody's life by using shame. And I think it's a dangerous way of creating change. Right. And like, I don't want to communicate to you that you shouldn't be overweight because look at yourself, you look terrible. Like that would be shameful. And that would be a shameful thing to do to somebody, right?
Yeah, right.
That's wrong. Don't do that. It's, you should be like, we're all creating God's image. We're all like, God's called us all artwork that he's proud of, no matter what shape or size or ability or inability you have as a human being. But I can also bring in hope to the situation, right? Like rather than bringing shame into a situation and talking about how you are currently and how you should be ashamed about it, I think that the gospel way of doing this is to talk about what could be and what should be. Yeah. And what's possible. Yeah. And this is what the gospel does, right? Like the reason the gospel is powerful is because it reminds us that our current state is not ideal. Yeah. And there is an ideal state that is possible and has been paid for, and you only have to ask for it, and it's granted to you. Right. Like the whole point of the gospel is hope, and the whole point of the gospel is recognizing that your current place and your current status isn't ideal. You want something better.
So here's a concept. Here's stumbled into things. Scripture verse, right? Man, I wish I could come up with it right off the top of my head as to its location. But Paul is talking. Maybe it's even First Timothy. Paul is talking to the culture, and he says, "If you're a slave, this is interesting." He says, "If you're a slave, don't seek to be free. But if the freedom comes, take it."
Yeah.
Right? So there's almost this thing. I'm not even sure that when he's saying seek, it's like, it's almost like if you're a slave, if you're in this condition, don't make your entire life about being a non-slave. But if the opportunity comes for you to be free, take the opportunity.
Sure.
Which is another hope word.
Right.
It's opportunity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All these words connected to hope.
Sure. I think in that situation, like, Paul, like, if you're a slave and becoming free is your obsession, now you're into idolatry, right? Your freedom has become your idolatry, not Christ.
Yeah.
Christ is no longer your king. You have an idol in its freedom. And so Paul is cautioning against this. And, and idolatry could be in opposition to hope as well.
Yeah.
But anytime you place something in priority above your relationship with the Lord, it's an idol. And that's the caution there. And I think in a lot of areas in our life, like, that's the caution too, right? Like, if you become so obsessed with weight loss that you lay aside your regular time of devotion so that you can be on your treadmill in the morning, right? Like, I don't have time for both. I'm going to go run. That's a problem. Don't do that. You're making something an idol, right? Like, you're putting aside your relationship with the Lord to work on something else. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Properly orient your life so you can do both, perhaps, but don't make this thing an idol. And that's just a little side caution there. There is a difference here.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think going back to the idea of hope, like, hope is motivating, and hope is probably a better motivator than fear.
Yes.
It's just that our culture really is working on that whole fear as motivation piece. It's how we arrange our news media. It's what gets clicks on the internet. The algorithm in your, like, Facebook feed understands fear. I was talking with somebody recently who was complaining about the things that were coming up in their feed. He's like, all I get are these videos that I don't like, and I just keep trying to get rid of them. It's really frustrating. And it's because the algorithm that's built behind that feed understands that fear is motivates you to keep looking at stuff.
Yeah.
And it's more powerful. It can be more powerful in certain circumstances than hope and then good. And so it'll keep sending you the stuff you dislike because it knows that you'll turn it on and keep looking at it. And so hope and fear are at odds.
Yes.
And our culture at the moment is leveraging fear to sell you stuff.
Right.
And the gospel-oriented person needs to remember that fear loses and hope wins.
Always.
And it's our job to continue to choose hope and pursue hope and lay aside fear in the search for hope.
Right. Because fear doesn't have creativity in it. Okay. Fear is more about
slavery, right? Like,
fear is slavery.
Yeah.
It wants to pull things back. It wants to make sure. Fear wants to make sure that everything is happening the same way it always has happened. Because
what you know is safer than what you don't know.
Right.
Even if what you don't know could be better, it is easier to work with predictable.
Because any change creates the possibility that it will never happen again. So you've got to so we're working on fear. Let's keep things the same. Let's not try and step out of things. Let's keep it close.
Keep it close, keep it safe, keep it predictable.
Yep.
These are all enemies to hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And hope is more along the lines of, boy, I wonder if we could do that.
Right.
You know? It's the crazy stuff. It's the, I wonder if we can go to the moon, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a, wow, we could do that. And the thing about hope, and take that, just a human concept, all right? Because I'm not opposed to human hope, just recognizing that human hope has limitations, right? But, let's just think about like going to the moon in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
We hope to get there, and it's not I don't know if we're going to do it, but it's more along the lines of, we can do this if we can put all of the pieces together. All of the things that were done to get us to the moon created better stuff for all of us.
Sure. Yeah. All these inventions that come out of the moon landings, right? Like
Absolutely.
Everything from like your memory foam mattress to the GPS in your car, you can thank the moon, the pursuit of the moon for.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And at the time, there was all of this complaint about, we're spending all of this money on
Right. What a waste.
Going to the moon. What a terrible waste of time, And,
yeah.
And, of course, the killer was, for NASA was that people weren't watching the coverage of going to the moon anymore after we got to the moon, Apollo 11, everybody watched that.
Yeah.
Apollo 12, Apollo 13, everybody watched to see who was going to die.
Right. But they weren't watching until things went wrong.
Right.
Fear.
Right. Fear.
Fear
right,
got clicks
right.
then.
Apollo 14, who even,
People stopped watching.
People stopped watching. And so all of a sudden they weren't getting television ratings. So all of that creativity, in a sense, died because now they're not going to do it. We're not going to do that anymore. And therein, so here's one of those things about human hope. Human hope is always limited. Hoping in God is limitless because God is limitless.
Right. Right. And what he's capable of doing is limitless.
Right. And he's already told us that there are things that we need to build on to build hope in our lives. So we have the hope of our salvation, which identifies the reality that we don't have to carry guilt around with us anymore. So you're not internally beating yourself up because of sin in your life. You don't have to cut your hair off and go around mourning because you're a sinner. You don't have to live in death and dress yourself in black and dye your hair black and just do all of that. You don't have to cut yourself because you've got guilt in your life, and maybe if you make some small razor cut incisions on your body where no one's going to see them, you can live in some pain and try and deal with all. The hope of your salvation says none of that's worthwhile.
Yeah, it's funny because all of these things are culturally part of. These are things Christians have wrestled with for generations, right? Like the early monks are doing all of these things.
Yes,
right?
they're
wearing burlap. They're shaving their head. They're cutting themselves,
beating themselves,
yeah. Right? And they've lost because they lost sight on the hope of the gospel.
Yes,
and that happens in our culture today with all of the same things.
Yeah, the just shall live by faith.
Yeah,
yes.
I think about this contrast. Like hope asks something of you that's dangerous in almost all circumstances, and you have to choose hope over fear. They are opposites. But pursuing hope over fear leads to great blessing. And there are challenges that come, but also it leads to great blessing.
Yeah.
Because our God is a God of hope. And I think you have to pursue that because there's trust and all these other things that come into play when you step out in hope. This thing about asking my wife out for the very first time. And that's a scary thing. And any of you who are dating, in a committed relationship, or you're married, those first moments of asking or being asked and saying yes, in that relationship, saying yes was a moment of terrifying hope most of the time, right?
Yeah.
I am putting myself out in a moment of risk and in fear. There is the potential for rejection. There's the potential for hurt. There's the potential for a radical life change that I don't have control over, and it's not predictable. And to say yes is to open yourself up to all of those possibilities, but to say yes is an act of hope.
Yes.
I hope this relationship works, and I hope this leads somewhere, and I hope it brings fulfillment, and I hope it brings a good into my life.
Yeah.
But it requires stepping away from a moment of fear.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who walk through life so paralyzed by fear that they won't step into hope. And they will miss out on all of the blessing that comes with hope.
Yeah.
And not just in relationships, but in general.
Oh, yeah, in all of life.
And all of life. You may have the next great invention, but the actual like startup means you have to quit your job and you have to raise some funding, and you're not quite sure whether your income will produce enough to survive. And you may have to eat ramen noodles and live in a studio apartment or something in order to see your dream come true. But if you don't step out in that moment, then the world may miss out on your creativity and your brilliance. And we may never see that incredible invention that changes everything.
Right.
All of these things of hope, like we see this, it's part of the American like DNA, is that we as a culture should be a people who act out of hope because we see a better possibility in the future. And all of that is rooted in what made America in the first place, that there were a group of people.
We're going back to that Great Awakening link.
Who recognized that there was something better than what they had, and it was going to be dangerous to achieve. But because they're motivated by the hope of the gospel, and because they're motivated by the hope of a culture and a society that could be connected by that gospel and a place that could bring great blessing, they stepped out, and we're here because of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you go back to like our first dozen episodes to hear more about story of hope.
Yeah.
And these things I think are you're talking about the difference between human hope and biblical hope. I think they're related. But for the Christian, like our hope is so much more sure. Like if if I have the hope of an entrepreneur, right? I have a great business idea. Or a great invention, and I need to just go out and raise funding and, be uncomfortable and put myself out there. Like I may become wealthy. I may help the world become a better place. I may get to a point where my company employs thousands of people because I stepped out in this act of hope. And that's a great thing. It's a powerful thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But if I act out of the hope of the gospel,
yes,
right? That God is real, that he sent his son to die on the cross for us, and that sacrifice on the cross of his perfect son brings salvation and eternity, and I act out of that, then the ripple effect.
Add one. And that he's coming back for us.
Yes. Yeah, right. Then
to live with him forever.
If I act out of that level of hope, the reward is so much greater.
Yes.
And the cost is a lot smaller. We didn't have to pay for it.
Right.
The reality is that God already paid the cost. He put the down payment or deposit down on this act of hope by sending his son in the first place, by taking the penalty of our sin upon himself, and by offering himself up as a sacrifice for us. All of that payment for that like realized hope has already happened. Like for us, the response is to continue to act in hope. Like I may be ostracized culturally. I might be uncomfortable when I have this conversation with a dear friend. They may not like it at my office if I talk about my faith. My family may become uncomfortable or may like kick me out. But in relation to what is gained by pursuing that hope, those are small things.
Yeah. Well, here's the hope thing, right? Hope comes from the fact that the gospel is greater than you,
mm-hmm.
and what you do in sharing the gospel could bring hope to somebody else in the future. Here's the deal. Hope says, I'm not playing this game for me. I'm playing this game for the long haul.
Mm-hmm.
Many years ago, I had a church that was the church building's roof was beginning to leak. And we looked at the shingles. The shingles were 30 years old on the roof. They actually had been installed improperly. There was a part of my leadership team that said, "Well, that's the first roof up there. We can just put another layer of shingles on top of that."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, what do we gain from that?" "Well, it's cheaper. We don't have to take the other off, and we don't have to get rid of it." I said, "But no, what do we gain from that?"
Mm-hmm.
Do we gain 25 years? No, because if you put shingles on top of shingles, you actually deteriorate the new set of shingles faster.
Mm-hmm.
All of these guys were in their 60s and 70s, and they were just kind of They were kicking the can down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, do not make the next generation pay for what you have. This church is going to live a lot longer than you.
Mm-hmm.
Tear the roof off, put new shingles on.
Mm-hmm.
Because you live in hope.
Right.
You live in hope. One of my favorite hope stories, we're almost at the end of our time, but
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite hope stories is that Jeremiah,
I know
the
that
weeping prophet, the guy who is saying, all is lost, all is lost, all is lost, throughout his entire book.
Mm-hmm.
God says to him, Jeremiah, take some money, and there's a field for sale behind the potter's shed.
Mm-hmm.
Go buy that field. Make sure you get the deed, because 70 years from now, I'm bringing Israel back. And I want you to have a piece of what's happening in the future.
Mm.
And Jeremiah goes out and buys a field that he's about to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Because God said, I'm bringing you back.
Mm.
I need you to go and express your hope. Live in hope.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Live in the reality that God answers prayer, that God means what he says when he prophesies, that God has a plan for the future, that God has good stuff planned. Live in hope and communicate that hope to others. We need to live as Christians more like Jeremiah buying a field than Jeremiah saying everything is over.
Yeah, so true. And I think we're leading the charge in the everything is over camp right now.
We are at right now, yeah.
It's too many Christians that I know are complaining about politics and culture, and not enough of them are proclaiming hope. And my hope for you who are listening to this podcast today is that you would be proclaimers of hope.
Yes.
Don't be dragged into fear, but proclaim hope wherever you go. It's easier, I think, to make that proclamation this season than it is at other points in the year. So start now and start talking about hope. One of the things I talk about with my high school students a lot is, and we'll close on this thought, but one of the things I talk about a lot with my high school students is like being nice does not make you different than the culture. You know, we talk about like as Christians, we should look different. We should be different than the culture around us. And for years, we've interpreted that as we're going to be nice to people. We're going to be kind, we're going to be loving, and that's going to distinguish us. But our culture, I think our culture in general values niceness and kindness and lovingness, right? Like you'll see love is love.
Culture.
Right? You'll see love is love everywhere, and you'll be manipulated at some point, right?
Yeah.
But the idea is that's a value still. So you're not going to look any different than somebody who doesn't know Jesus if you're nice.
Right.
What will make you look different is if you walk in hope.
Right.
And you don't proclaim how everything is falling or everything is getting worse or everything is this or that. Like, you don't complain, bring hope. That will make you different. That will make people say, hey, what is it about this hope that you have? Like, that's Peter, right?
Yes.
Like, what makes you different is your hope.
Yes.
So walk in hope, be a people who share hope, and let's hope for a great Christmas season together. Yeah. We're glad you're with us. Thanks for joining in. We hope we'll be back here with you next week. Bye, everyone. You have been listening to Inside the Pastor Study podcast with Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Artwork by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sam Demetrius, and engineering help from Ashley Gallagher. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.